We hope you find the evening informative and helpful, and in fact, it's just worth noting that each of our panelists tonight is either a client through our ACT program or through our Public Management Programs Board Fellows.
We're going to have all of the panel, starting with me, speak for about 10 minutes, just sharing sort of their top insights on what being an effective nonprofit board and board member is, both from the board member's perspective and in Jackie's case, also from the executive director's view. We're also, after that and before question and answering, going to try something we haven't done before, which is on your seats you'll see a very short page-and-a-half case. And so after we all speak, we're going to ask you to, amongst yourselves, just 3 or 4 of you talk about what you're going to do with the Deadwood case. And then we'll leave, hopefully, a healthy time to answer questions either about the case or questions of general interest. Let me just begin with what I think of as the 9 attributes of successful nonprofit boards. We gave you a much longer report that we did at McKinsey. Here I'll try to be more pithy and to the point. Let me just read the 9 attributes and then I'll talk very briefly about 2 or 3. In terms of missions and goals, I think a nonprofit board that's successful, above all, has an ambitious mission which is well and clearly identified. It has intermediate goals which are directly related to the identified mission, and the board's role and responsibilities in achieving that mission is explicit and it's well understood. In terms of structure and organization and composition, good boards have a small group of committed and cohesive leaders. They have the appropriate composition to provide the necessary skills, financial means, and perspective, the 3 W's, if you will, of work, wealth, and wisdom. And they have a well-defined and understood structure for addressing the key tasks of the board. And in terms of governance processes, good nonprofit boards have a process for interacting on important issues that ensures that the right capabilities of the board are brought to bear on those issues. They have a process that ensures that board members view their time as well spent, and a process to engage board members in the substance of the organization. Now, you probably notice immediately that my 9 attributes are more principles than rules. And on things that nonprofit governance, many people in the first instance want a hard, fast set of rules. And I try to avoid those rules for one very good reason, I think, which is you give me a rule and I'll show you a nonprofit board which obeys it and is not very effective, and I'll show you a nonprofit board that disobeys it and is very effective. So I rely much more on general principles. So let me just talk about 2 or 3 that I think perhaps are the most important. The old Sicilian axiom is that a fish rots with his head, and nonprofits tend to rot from a mission statement and a board that's not committed to it and not energized by it. My class has just finished an exercise where they all went through and analyzed mission statements, and as happens every year, 2/3 or 3/4 discover that the mission statement as reported is either not really the mission statement, or the mission of the organization is different than the mission statement, or key stakeholders, including the board members, are unaware of what the mission of the organization really is. And it's incumbent upon any board, particularly in organizations that have been around for a while, that they go through some kind of exercise on a regular basis, that the board of the day gets to take that mission in its own heart and its own soul and become energized by the mission of that organization. I think the leading cause of boards that are not effective in the first instance are that they don't understand and embrace the mission of the organization they're involved in. Probably the most often asked question about rules is, how big should my nonprofit board be? And the answer is 13. Actually, I don't have a hard and fast rule. I've seen lots of nice, tightly knit small boards that don't work very well, and I've actually been on boards of 85 people that work very effectively. My rule of thumb is that a board can be as large as such that it allows no more than 10 or 15% of the board members to be inactive. If you can have a large board with very active board members, in development, in the organization itself, in volunteering, in committee work. There are lots of very well accepted structures through committees and long-range planning processes that you can keep many, many board members involved. In the end, these things tend to just follow the rules of small group dynamics. And if you have a board of 15 people, you'll be very lucky indeed if you have 3 or 4 board members who are truly committed to that organization and devoting a lot of time. And if you have a board of 60 or 70, you might have 12 or 15. But I don't think board size in and of itself is something you can have a hard and fast rule about. The last attribute I'll call attention to is engaging the board in what I call the thing itself. It's remarkable how many boards, particularly some that people think are very well written, you go to the hour-and-a-half board meeting and it just goes right through the agenda. And one thing is for sure, is the staff is going to make sure that the board hears everything it wants to hear and has very little time to engage in open discussion. And at the same time, very often you'll see boards that spend very little time on the thing itself. And I would argue very strongly that boards for nonprofits, if it's a child care nonprofit, that the board has to have regular exposure to child care. If it's a symphony nonprofit, it needs to have regular exposure to symphony musicians and musician directors. If it's an art nonprofit, it should be art, whatever else it is. Those of us who serve on nonprofits serve primarily out of passion and interest in the organization, and we expect through the board processes to be given regular opportunities to engage with the thing itself. So I'll leave it right there and turn it over to Susan Ford Dorsey.
Sorry. Thank you. It really is a great pleasure to be here today. As Bill said, I currently serve on a number of boards, from healthcare to my son's elementary school to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and each one of those is very different. And over the past 15 years, I've had the pleasure of serving on a few other boards, so I feel like I've got some experience to share about some of the size and some of the qualities that make a board function and some of the qualities that make a board sort of dysfunctional. I'm also on a corporate board, so I kind of have the perspective of that as well. I also have had the pleasure of serving with 2 of the Stanford Board Fellows, one with Children's Health Council and the other recently on the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and I can say in both instances that they really added a great deal to the board, and that sort of fresh perspective was very important for all of us. Okay, so the 3 most important things that I think a board can do and what makes a board highly functional as opposed to dysfunctional. The first is to focus on what's important. Now that sounds axiomatic. However, it is amazing how many boards do get mired down in the details and, as Bill mentioned, sort of what the staff wants to present and doesn't really focus on, in fact, what is its important work. The first thing and the most important thing a board can do is hire and fire the CEO. If the CEO is strong, then that makes the organization strong, obviously, and it is the single most important thing that a board, and a big responsibility that the board has. The second thing is to focus on the key indicators in an organization. Every organization is different, but I remember a few years ago going to a board training or governance training, and the professor was talking about creating sort of a dashboard, if you will, for each organization, that every board member knows what these 5 or 6 really important indicators are of the health of the organization, whether it's, enrollment, if it's a school, the gas gauge could be, the fundraising dollars, the operating expenses could be the speedometer, whatever it seems to be the most logical sort of way for the board in the snapshot to get the best view of how the organization is doing that quarter, that month compared to last year, those things. And that's the responsibility really of the CEO and the senior staff to try to figure out what this board needs to know so that when things start going south or improving, that they're able to have that perspective. The other thing is to be strategic. The opposite of that, I guess, is getting mired down in the micromanagement. But the board is the one that is supposed to look down at an organization and to keep that big perspective so that you can look at trends. You can think of the literature in terms of what how this organization compares to its peers, to what's happening in the industry. You know, if it's a school that depends upon state funding and state funding is being decreased, then that's likely to continue. And what is the impact on the services going to be? So it's the board's responsibility to think about what is going to drive this organization several years down the road. And every meeting should have a purpose. It's remarkable to me how many people attend board meetings and you sit there and the reports are read to you after you've of course already read them if you're prepared for the meeting, and that's not helpful. I mean, everybody goes away and that's the end of the meeting and everybody checks that off their list of things that they've done, but it doesn't move the organization forward. When I chair, I like to think of every meeting as having a purpose and saying at the very beginning, at the end of this meeting, we will have accomplished the following. Or today, we are going to hear about whatever the sort of program elements are, and from the providers, as Bill was talking about, either from the musicians or the teachers or whoever it happens to be. That gives you a good perspective. But it's really important to understand what decisions need to be made and how those decisions are going to be made. Okay, so that's number one, focus on what really is important and what is the appropriate board role. The second thing that I think is really important is to provide that the board should be a forum for the CEO to dream, to float trial balloons, to try out different ideas, to talk about greatest fears, that sort of thing. It really should be a sounding board, and they should feel free to do that. There's oftentimes a tension that exists between the CEO and the board, as in, I shouldn't tell the board this because they'll think I'm doing a bad job, they'll think the organization's in trouble, on and on. But that relationship is really, really important so that the CEO can feel supported in thinking beyond the day-to-day organizational issues. And then the third thing I would say is to as a board member, if you decide to go on a board, in addition to being hopefully passionate about that's the subject matter of the organization, that you also are willing to lend your expertise. Again, that sounds like a no-brainer, but I'm struck by how many times I've heard people say, gee, I want to go on this board because I want to learn about music or art, which is valid. That's fair. It's a great way to do it. But if it's like an accountant, they might say, I don't really want to be on the finance committee. I want to try, something else. Well, the reason you're asked to participate on a board is because of what you can bring to the organization, whether it's your own resource, your own dollars, your contacts, your expertise. So to say, you're a lawyer, but you're not going to provide any sort of legal assistance is really doing the agency a great disservice. And it's kind of surprising how people don't really sort of put those two together. So those are my top three. There are a lot of parts to that, and there are more too, but I think that sort of gives you sort of a sense of what the other, let me just say one pet peeve I have. It's the number of people who say, I'll join the board, but I don't want to raise money. I mean, that's sort of what you're asked to do. But that happens all the time. Don't ask me to ask anybody for money. Well, that's the way boards work.
Well, this evening, under the guidance of McKinsey and Company, we're all speaking in bullet points. So you had your 9, Susan had her 3, and I have, since I learned speaking from Fidel Castro, I have 63 points to make. But I'll break it into 2 categories. One is mechanics, and the other is mindset. And I suspect the second is the more important of the 2. In mechanics, since I come to this from the point of view of someone who was the CEO of a large nonprofit, and I've also served on the boards of large and small foundations and community-based organizations. The one thing that has struck me as most important is recognizing where you are in the life cycle of the organization. I'm getting some feedback. Most organizations, especially community-based organizations, start as volunteer efforts, And just as for-profit enterprises that, if they're successful, move from an entrepreneurial stage to a mature organization that requires more formal management, you see nonprofits moving from infancy through adolescence to maturity. And the shift from a volunteer or working board to a governing board or a fundraising board is often a very, very difficult shift. And I've been in the middle of that shift. I like sometimes to call the first stage the bake sale board, and it's very difficult in a community-based organization where a lot of devoted people have spent their time at that phase to recognize what's needed on a board as you grow. So that leads into my second bullet point, which is you have to be very clear about what the board function is. You have to tie it to mission. I think you're right, Bill, that the mission of the organization is frightfully important. And the board function really has to be tied to that. And the board, as Susan says, has to be very clear what's the role of the CEO and what's the role of the board. Because if you're not clear, you're headed for trouble and conflict. Then how do we get the board together? I think you have to have very clear criteria for selection and retention of board members. These criteria have to be tied to the mission and accomplishing the mission. And you have to think about whether in your context you need terms for service on the board, whether you need term limits for service on the board, and what kind of evaluation of the service of people on the board is healthy and necessary. At the California Endowment, we actually have a self-critical system. We have self-evaluation every year by the board members, and we have a peer review of all the board members. That's a part of the process of the nominating committee deciding whether board members are going to continue. Then both Susan and Bill have mentioned a point or a topic that's, I think, very important. And that's how you structure board meetings and board participation. I bet everyone in this room who's been on any kind of a board has been to a board meeting where you've got a board book that's 3 inches thick, and then you had staff members essentially recite the contents of the board book back to you, leaving 10 minutes at the end of the day for board discussion. And it is either a conscious or an unconscious way to render board service absolutely ineffective. So in structuring in board participation, some of the kinds of things that I think you should pay attention to are frequency of meetings. One board I'm on has monthly meetings, and I don't believe busy people can really commit to monthly meetings. So if I have my way, that will change. The agenda. On agendas, I believe that the chair and the CEO or ED should pick 1 or 2 or maybe 3 topics where they really need the input of the board, and limit discussion to those things with an assumption that any good board member will have already read in advance all the materials that are presented. In terms of process, I hate split board votes, and because of what they do to the dynamics of a group of people serving on the board. And I think that the chair and board leadership should work on every issue toward board consensus. In my time as CEO of the California Endowment, I never had a split board vote. but that was because we made very sure that we didn't trample on the ideas of any members of the board. We worked to have consensus. I think that's very important. I also think that it's necessary to create an environment in which board members can mingle with each other, because a lot happens when the meeting is not being in process. I was going to tell you how big a board should be, but I've been told by McKinsey that it doesn't matter, so I'm going to skip that. My second general topic is mindset. And under that, two general categories. The first is sort of philosophical or approach, and that is that the most important thing in a foundation or a community-based organization, in my view, there are three of them. They're focus, focus, and focus. As an example, I will share with you the dilemma of the Sonoma Land Trust, where I'm on the board. Our mission is land preservation, and we acquire land in fee, we acquire conservation easements, we have an active stewardship program for the lands that we own, we contract to do land restoration for state agencies, we do environmental education, and we have been urged from time to time to engage in low-cost housing and political advocacy. And if we do all those things when our mission is land preservation, we ain't going to get the land preserved. So it's very important, as I think Bill was making the point, to continue to loop back to your mission and be sure you're focused on the mission. Another thing that's quite important to me is to avoid intellectual incest. I often hear people in the selection of directors saying we should have them on the board because they share our values. In a lot of ways, I prefer to have people who don't share my values. I would like to have people who will take a different point of view on subjects on the board, so that you really can have an exploration of important issues, rather than automatically knowing when the issue comes up that everybody on this board is going to agree on it. So I'm a big fan of intellectual diversity. Now the other mindset issue for me is whose money is it anyway? I feel very passionately that once money gets into a foundation or into a nonprofit, it does not belong to the directors. It does not belong to the staff. It belongs to the charitable beneficiaries. And it's too easy to forget that. We've had a lot of examples in the last year in the nonprofit area, concerns in the land conservation area with the deals between the board of directors and the organization on pieces of land. And I've personally had the experience of my salary and benefits showing up on the front page of the San Jose Mercury, so I know how close it can get. Fortunately, the other fellow had a bigger salary and a smaller foundation. So I think it's really important in these days to realize that the corporate scandals and the effects of Sarbanes-Oxley, although they don't literally apply to nonprofits, that's the tenor of the world that we're living in. And there's an article in this week's Forbes, as a matter of fact, on foundation excesses. Then you also, in the whose money is it anyway, need to need to have a board that assures that there are prudent internal controls. And I'll just give you 2 examples on that. One, a CFO, not at the California Endowment, who said to me, why do we need an audit? Don't you trust me? And another, which some of you are old enough to remember, in San Francisco some 20 years ago, the executive director of ACT decided that gold was a good thing to invest in, so he put the entire endowment of the organization in gold, and gold went down, and ACT almost went out of existence. So it's really important for directors to protect the principle that it ain't their money and it ain't the staff's money. It belongs to charitable beneficiaries, and they are the trustees of it. Finally, I will end by saying that I think the most important thing in being a director of a nonprofit, the most important things are really personal characteristics and behavior, and not the things we've been talking about before. And I just jotted down 4 words. One is passion. I heard that word before. Another is trust. A board doesn't work unless personal bonds of trust are created among the members. A third is candor. It doesn't work if what's said in the boardroom is different from what's said out in the hall outside the boardroom. And finally, I will close with the fact that a successful board requires respect for diverse ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Lew. Jackque?
Okay. My favorite Aesop fable is 3 men trying to describe the elephant. And I'm sure most of you know this, but one is feeling his side and says, oh, very much like a rock. And the other one's got hold of his leg and said, no, it's very much like a tree. And of course, the other one has the trunk and says, oh, no, it's like a snake. Now, they were all right, and I think that organizations are somewhat like that. I think that organizations are perceived and described by wherever your contact is, and it's different for the participants in the organization and for the board members in the organization and for the executive director of an organization. And this is one of the reasons why one of the most critical relationships and challenging relationships in an organization is that between the executive director or CEO and that board of directors. They have to be partners, or you cannot implement the vision of the organization and its goals. In Bill's point 3 here about roles and responsibilities, this is true in relationship to the executive director as well as in relationship to the board itself. And in an oversimplified but true statement, you might say that the board is in charge of policy and the executive director or CEO is in charge of implementing that policy. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Also, number 4, about having to have clear structure and expectations. That, too, is true for an executive director or CEO as well as for board members. You get into real big trouble when the staff executive is moving independently from and forward without the support and without the interaction with policy. But you also get into big trouble when the board members get too involved in the management and the administration of the organization and get involved in micromanagement. Some of those key issues that tend to be conflict areas are usually around the issues of money and of personnel. And when you get into those conflicts, it's difficult to have a negotiation effective between difference of opinion with the executive director and the board, because reality is every wise executive director and CEO knows that the power is in the board of directors. They are the authority of the organization. They are the legal authority of the organization. And in the principles of mediation and negotiation, we know that one of the principles that is required is parity of power. And yet we don't really have parity of power between those two entities, but there's got to be a way in which that is balanced out so that the board and the executive can work in a true partnership. Now this is somewhat complicated by the fact that all of us wear so many hats. I serve on boards. I'm currently president of a board. My board members are CEOs and EDs as well as being board members. And this is pretty true in the nonprofit world, particularly my type of organization. So that when you try to make those distinctions between policy issues and implementation issues, you've got to think which hat you're wearing at the moment, because in this situation, you're executive director, and in another situation, you might be a board member. So these things tend to make life even more complicated. And I believe in paradox and in having to be able to embrace multiple truths that seem contradictory. You have a scene out there, and different people looking through different windows at the same scene are going to see different things. And out of that, you get a different perception of both what the problem is and what the solution might be. I've been the executive director of two new organizations where I was the founding or the initial director. I have been the director of two old organizations and one in between. My present organization, the YMCA of Oakland, is 125 years old this year. So, you know, your cycles that you go through, there's also a big difference in working with an organization with the traditions of the YMCA of Oakland, which was the first west of Mississippi and so forth, and in a Julia Morgan building and all that good stuff. Very different from a brand new small organization. As an executive director, the values that I would look for, and you do have some influence in choosing the board members, but you don't really choose the board members, but you do have some influence from time to time. And those things that I would value are, first of all, that they have a passion for the mission, that they not only understand the mission, but that they have a passion for the mission. Secondly, I value a positive attitude. I mean, I want a board that's made up mostly of half-full cups and not half-empty cups. And you need to keep that positive energy going. Right now, my present board cheerleader is Renee, who's a media person, and she's just wonderful. And she's at that meeting, you're going to have a positive atmosphere. The second is respect, and that's a part of trust. And that is absolutely essential to contain diversity in an organization. And I'm talking about all kinds of diversity: age, cultural, ethnic, economics, skills, and etc. And there I think about the president of my board of directors in Washington at the Daycare and Child Development Council of America. It was Jackque Waren, who was president of Bank Street College. And this man just you know, that just radiated out of him. And he was able, as a board president, to always manage it so that respect was always on the ground floor. The other thing I value is balance. I think you have to have a good balance between caution and risk-taking. There's a time when you just got to go for it. And with the organization, the YMCA of Oakland went through a major crisis and almost went under with problems with the rebuild of the building after the Loma Prieta earthquake. And you got to be willing to let go sometimes your caution and just go for it, or you'll lose the ball game. Also, you've got to have balances between being serious and having fun. And I think of my board member, Viola Gonzalez, who says, if it's not fun, I'm not going to do it. And I think that one of the things that the executive director plays a major role in is how fun it is for these people to get together and to be able to plan so that you can enjoy what you're doing, because there are not a lot of, it's hard work and not a lot of rewards in the nonprofit community. If you're not having fun, it's hard to keep doing it. I also value a board of directors who's got the right mix of what I would call workhorses and show horses. You got to have outstanding people in your community that will a visible recognition, but you got to have those workhorses, and I try every chance I get to power them up because you just, you know, you need them, both of them going together. Finally, the bottom line for me is that I want a board to work with a board that helps me and that I can help them stay out of, get out of, and stay out of what I call the W family, and that is the wonder, worry, and whine. When organization's in trouble, it is so easy to stay in that room of the wonder, worry, and whine, and I'm sure that we don't have to even talk about the many ways that can manifest itself. You got to get out of there and get into the A family, which is affirm, assess, and act. And actually, that's so important to me now that when I start worrying about problems in the middle of the night, I actually start doing that mantra, affirm, assess, and act. And it's become clear to me that you have to affirm first. When you're dealing with difficult problems, you got to affirm that you've dealt with more difficult problems. EDs and CEOs need the board to affirm them and the good things that they're doing before they get in on the subject of the things that are not going so well. But once you affirm, and then you assess, and then you're able to act and stay in that mode, and that's really the bottom line for me, and that's what my goal is as an executive director and working with a board of directors to achieve our common goal.